do you have questions about this Polish issue, which we had started discreetly last time? No questions so far? Okay. Now, remember the Czechoslovakia disappeared after the coup of Prague. That is March, by the way, we could even have commemorated the March 15th, the Ides of March, 1939. And we also had, I'm not repeating it, we saw the consequences. The consequences were far-reaching, a total change in attitude, first of all, of Chamberlain and the Western democracies, and also total change in attitude of Stalin. And we have examined why these changes came about. Now again, we proceed in our threefold way. That is origins, events, and then consequences. The origins first. Now the origins, why he turned to Poland, expecting that the Poles would agree to a number of frontier arrangements. In other words, that they would agree to turn back to Germany territories they had annexed in the wake of World War I, and more precisely, the territory which split Germany in two. The main part located on the western area, and the other part, Eastern Prussia, as it is called, was the eastern part of Germany. By the way, you should know that this eastern part of former Germany is now Russian territory. Russia has an enclave. In other words, Russia has a territory which is separated from the Russian mainland, separated by Poland and the Baltic states, but Stalin did annex this territory after World War II, and it's now still Russian territory. And the capital of this territory was the former German city of Königsberg, where even Immanuel Kant, the greatest German philosopher, was born and where he lived, and now it's called Kaliningrad, after one of Stalin's lieutenants. It is now Russian territory. Well, after this little digression, let's turn back. So Hitler wanted the Poles to give in, to accept that they would return this territory, and more precisely one city, which was located which is now called Gdansk. The German name was Danzig. It was a German city, and this city was, in Hitler's days, in 1939, under international administration. It was not under German administration, and Hitler wanted to get it back. And he wanted to bring the Poles to make this concession, because that was a part of his preliminaries before he would attack the Soviet Union. We do not know, because he was not precise about it, what he had really in mind with the Poles and with Poland. Because after all, despite of the good relations Austria and Hitler even felt towards the Poles were after all a Slav population. And the Slavs in Hitler's racialist blindness were an inferior race. So in other words, he did not have the utmost respect for them, but from historical past, he did not have the same kind of negative attitudes he had cultivated, the same as the Austrians towards the Czechs. Now, so in other words, these were the origins. And Hitler tried now to bring the Polish ambassador in Berlin to come to terms with him, and act also through the German ambassador in Warsaw. But the Poles had, in those days, a military dictatorship. We will have to face this. Although when we go to Krakow and to Auschwitz, our guide will not insist so much on this issue, because the man who had established this military dictatorship, he is still considered at the present time as a national hero. That was Pilsudski. Pilsudski, you find the name in Bullock without problems. Pilsudski was an a Polish nationalist who, after 1918, at the end of World War I, was responsible for bringing about the proclamation of Polish independence. And even though Poland was originally, for a short time, a democracy, but these democratic institutions, not more than in other Eastern European countries, did not survive in the 10 years which followed World War I, Pilsudski took power, and he was a military dictator. He was not of the fiercest kind. It was rather a patriarchalic, authoritarian dictatorship. It was not a bloody dictatorship as we usually think about when we speak about military dictatorship. But it was a dictatorship. So when he died in 1935, he got, and we will see that when we visit his funeral monument in the Cathedral of Krakow, he got a national funerals. He was a great hero. But when he died, he left an advice to his successors. His successors were military men. They are sometimes referred to as the colonels, because those who dominated in this kind of leadership were a number of colonels. He told them that they should, under no circumstance, ever begin negotiating with the Germans. When he died, that was 1935, that was 1 year after he had signed the non-aggression pact. But Pilsudski said, you should not begin negotiating, because then you are lost. The Germans only understand one language, that clear one, no. And so they said no. And that was exactly what Hitler could not stand. He flew into a rage when the Poles turned him down, that they did not even want to negotiate with him. And so he decided, he was so furious that from now on, he had this kind of hatred for the Poles, he would look to it that they would pay for it. So he gave the order then to the army to prepare the invasion of Poland, the attack, for late August. He picked even ultimately date August 26. But of course, that he could give this order, and the army leadership prepared the war plans. And I told you that the Poles were, in military terms, in a desperate situation, because the Germans were on three sides. They were north, the northern part, that was this eastern Prussia, that is this territory which they separated from the German mainland. The Germans were on the western side, that was the huge frontier from north till the former Czech border. And they were on the southern side, because they had occupied now what was Czechoslovakia, and they had military bases in Slovakia. So in other words, purely in strategic terms, this was absolutely a desperate situation. But the Poles, they overrated their strengths. The Poles considered themselves as a great power, the same as the French, the Italians, the British, and the Germans. But their army, the Polish army, was essentially equipped with weapons the French had turned over to them after World War I, or even in the years following. They did not have the most modern equipment, in other words. They had even a cavalry which was a cavalry and not armored divisions or motorized divisions. Whereas the German army, which had a brand new equipment which Hitler had, instigated and organized after 1933, the German army equipment was by far superior, and in every sense, the Germans had superior weapons and also a bigger army, and that they had also excellent generals. In other words, the Poles were at a completely disadvantage. Nonetheless, Hitler could not bluntly act as if he had wanted, and as he did with Czechoslovakia. In other words, he had now to consider the international situation. And there was one thing which he needed absolutely to achieve before attacking Poland. And that was, he had to make a deal with Stalin. Because he knew that the British had given, in the wake of his occupation of Prague, the British had signed a military guarantee treaty with Poland that in case Poland would be attacked, that the British would declare war and would come to the rescue of Poland. So what the British did, the French were following up. So in other words, he knew that if he attacked Poland, that's a likelihood that France and Great Britain would go to war with him. That this was very great. Now, he was not impressed any longer with the military power of the Western democracies, because meanwhile his military potential was bigger. But there was one unknown entity which had been neglected so far all the time, and that was Stalin. He could not afford, and his generals had made it very clear to him, he could not afford a war on two fronts, as Germany had faced it in 1914. Now, Hitler considered that the Poles were not a match, that this war would be over very quickly. But what next? If Stalin would then open hostilities in Eastern Europe, on his Eastern Front. And that was something he could not consider, because he was not strong enough, and so he had to avoid this by all means. So he had to do everything to keep Stalin out. Now, when we look on the events on this Polish question, on this Polish crisis, the origins were he wanted now to settle accounts with the Poles, because that was a part of his preliminaries. What were now the events which will lead to the outbreak of the war? The events were the following. Stalin, who had been marginalized, who had been left aside from 1933, 1934 on, the Western democracies had not bothered to invite him and had not seriously thought to make an alliance with him. And Hitler had considered him as the enemy, because Hitler was an anti-communist, and he had sent this treaty with Poland, this non-aggression pact. Now, all of a sudden, Stalin found himself being courted by the Western democracies and by Hitler. Hitler needed to keep Stalin out of the game. And the Western democracies considered that they were not enough of a deterrent, that they needed Stalin's alliance all of a sudden. When he had offered his alliance, they had shown him deaf ears. Now all of a sudden they considered it was important that they would get this alliance. And so both sides now made approaches to get Stalin on their side. Stalin, on the contrary, very coldly calculated what was his interest, the Russian interest. Now, I admit that later on, when the war was on, before Hitler attacked Stalin in June 1941, it was current in our Western historiography to accuse Stalin for being co-responsible for the outbreak of the war, because he signed an agreement with Hitler, a non-aggression pact. And later on, when the war was over and the Cold War started, so there you see how history very often undergoes different interpretations. When again the West was at loggerheads with the Soviet Union and was now the enemy, Stalin again got a very bad rating in Western histories because of this non-aggression pact, and particularly when it was discovered the secret clauses of this pact, which became out only when the war was over and when the Western Allies discovered the German archives. But what was now really Stalin's decision? What were the alternatives? Hitler offered Stalin, we will see that we first have to see the different stages until they sign. But Hitler offered Stalin what? a non-aggression pact, that is, not to be forced to enter the war. And as a kind of reward for this, as a deal, he offered Stalin practically those territories which Russia had lost in the wake of World War I and in the wake of the revolution. That is, an open hand as far as Finland was concerned, an open hand as far as the Baltic countries were concerned, and also eastern territories of eastern Poland and even territories of northeastern Romania. That is, all those territories which had been Tsarist territories in the old days and which were lost, as I said, in the wake of World War I and the Russian Revolution. So in other words, Stalin got territories, he did not have to enter the war, and these territories represented, nonetheless, an additional defense line towards the West in case Hitler would attack him later. Yes?
Did Hitler have any say in whether or not Russia could be in these territories? They weren't German, were they?
No.
I mean, they just...
Yes, but they dealt with those countries as if they were masters, but in reality they didn't care. You had two dictators, and they did not care of what, the same as Hitler and the Western democracies had told about Czechoslovakia in Munich, where the Czechs were not even present. So in other words, these were deals beyond the heads, beyond those who were directly concerned with it. So, but my point is that these territories represented a possibility of an advanced defense line against Hitler, because Stalin knew that sooner or later Hitler would attack, and he would win time and territories to prepare for this ultimate showdown with Hitler, when Hitler would begin the conquest of living space. And what did now the Western democracies offer him for if he would enter an alliance with them? First of all, they offered him an alliance which would surely, sooner or later, lead right away into war with Hitler. In other words, by entering such an alliance, the possibilities that he would have to fight against Hitler Germany were very great. But there was even an additional difficulty, because Stalin did not have a common frontier with Germany. So in other words, he could not even fight against Germany right at the beginning, because he was separated from Germany by Poland and Romania, because Poland and Romania, they touched one another, and they were such that Stalin had no common frontier. And the Poles and the Romanians made it clear that they would, under no circumstances, allow the Red Army to cross their territory to get in touch with the Germans. So in other words, first of all, he would have to fight. Secondly, there were even difficulties that he could, in order to come close to Hitler. What did he get out of it now? Nothing. The Western democracies did not offer him anything else but the alliance and the perspective of having to go to war against Hitler. So in other words, in these circumstances, very honestly, what would you have done? Of course, you would have done what Stalin did, to make a deal, to win time and territory and stay out of the war. And precisely because there was an additional element, Stalin had suspected the Western democracies, particularly from 1936 on, and more so even from 1938 on, that they purposely pushed Hitler into a war against him. What did he do now? He turned the tables around. By being willing to make a deal with Hitler, he would push Hitler in a war against the West. So in other words, Stalin did win practically on every board by preparing himself for making this deal with Hitler. Now, how did this come? Because after all, these perspectives were evident from you could say from April 1939 on, because from April 1939 on, the danger of war was coming closer. And so what happened was Hitler now intensified the approaches to Stalin. The German ambassador in Moscow and the Russian ambassador in Berlin were now approached and said they were first told that they should prepare a commercial economic deal. And while they spoke about the commercial and economic deal, Hitler made it clear that he was also willing to make a political deal. Stalin was in no hurry, because Stalin had the satisfaction he was a pariah of earlier years. Now everybody was, trying to win him over. But the ultimate negotiations did take place in August 1939, and it was typical that they were, of course, prepared behind the stage, and Stalin had, of course, shown his willingness to be his readiness to make a deal with Hitler. I remember what I told you as a consequence of the coup of Prague. Stalin replaced Litvinov, the Jewish Minister of Foreign Affairs, by Molotov, his right-hand man. Stalin abstained from making any anti-German, anti-Nazi speeches any longer, particularly not at the party congress. So in other words, the open signs were there. He was willing to make a deal. So the French and the British, they sent then a delegation, or government delegations to Moscow, and Hitler will do the same. The French and the British took the boat, moved up through the Baltic, through the North Sea to the Baltic Sea to St. Petersburg, and took the train then to Moscow. If you add these all together, it was a matter of days, if not a week, before they would arrive. Hitler's envoy, and we know him, was Ribbentrop. And Ribbentrop, on the 23rd of August, took the airplane and flew to Moscow. He was there in 3 hours. And on the 23rd of August, he signed the treaty with Stalin. Hitler Germany, through Ribbentrop, and Stalin, they signed a non-aggression pact. And that, of course, was a stunning news. Nobody had been psychologically prepared, neither in the Soviet Union, but Stalin did not. He didn't have a public opinion. He didn't have to care. But even Comintern had not been warned. Nobody expected this. And in Hitler Germany, nobody expected this neither. All this was kept a secret. So the news were really breaking news. Non-aggression pact. What does that mean officially? That the two countries pledged themselves that they would not, in case of a war, enter an alliance against one another. But that was the official part of the treaty. There was a secret protocol added to it. And of course, this secret protocol did stick for both sides, but the outside world did not know about it. It was only after World War II that this secret protocol was discovered in the German archives by the Allies, by the Western Allies. And in this secret protocol, I make it short because that changes were later on, minor changes were brought. Hitler practically allowed Stalin to have a free hand. They divided up Eastern Europe into zones of influence. Stalin had a free hand in Finland, Baltic countries, and Hitler was willing, in case of a war with Poland, to allow Stalin to have Eastern Poland. That is this territory which the Poles had snatched away after World War I from the Russians, which were territories where there was some Polish population, but the majority of the population living there were white Russians and Ukrainians. And in addition, Hitler would also abandon to Stalin the country which is now an independent republic. It's called now Moldavia. That is, it is the area of northwestern, let me see, northern and northeastern part of Romania. It's now an independent republic. It's the poorest country in Europe, Moldavia. It's a neighbor country to the Ukraine at the present time. And it was, after World War II, a Soviet republic like all the others were Soviet republics. So this territory, Hitler also abandoned it to Stalin. That this was a secret protocol. Now, when this became known, of course, the Western delegates, the Western envoys returned home because their visit was now pointless. They had failed. The deal, Hitler had made the deal. But the reaction of the Western democracies was nonetheless important because the day afterwards, on the 24th of August, Chamberlain, and that was unexpected from a man who had practiced the appeasement policy, Chamberlain renewed his assurances that in case of an aggression of Germany against Poland, that the British would declare war on Hitler, that they would come to the rescue of Poland. And that is something Hitler had not reckoned with. Hitler, who was always gambling, and who had gotten away with this gamble so far, he was now taken by surprise. He had expected that the news of this non-aggression pact would ultimately enter the minds of the Western democracies, that they would find out that going to war to save Poland was pointless, that they could not save Poland any longer because Hitler's power was too strong. And therefore he expected that they would back off, that they would ultimately accept this kind of a situation. But of course this time it would be war. Before there were coups where no warlike operations had taken place, neither about Austria nor about Czechoslovakia. But Hitler expected that they would back off. And so he hesitated now. He called off the attack on the 26th of August and extended the beginning of the war till September 1st. And meanwhile, during those days, there was a kind of psychological, you could say psychological, I do not say warfare, but wrangling behind the stage. He expected that he would ultimately convince the British, because the French would follow what the British would decide, that he would convince the British to give up the Poles. But of course, and I would like to stress this very clearly, Hitler again made a mistake, and not only did he make a mistake, but the Poles also made a mistake about the interpretation they gave to the British commitment to go to war if Hitler would attack Poland. Hitler thought that the British Chamberlain should recognize that he had no chance to save Poland. And the Poles expected that the British and the French, because they were after all allies now, that they would come out for the defense of Poland. But on this point, they were wrong. And that is why you must keep that in mind, particularly you Americans, that even though Great Britain went to war when Hitler attacked, it was not to save Poland. They went to war because ultimately Chamberlain reverted to the old British foreign policy line that Hitler had become too strong, that they would have to fight to the finish to defeat Hitler, not to save Poland in 1939. That the war would be to bring Hitler down ultimately, not to save Poland in 1939, whereas the Poles expected that the French and the British would come out and would save them.
What's the I mean, why does it really matter what the reasoning is behind going to war? You know, either way, they went to war when they attacked Poland.
They went to war, but the Poles were the victims, because the Poles, if they had known that the British and the French would not fight for their independence, they would not have resisted for 4 weeks and accept all the destructions, the shelling and bombing of Warsaw and all these other casualties and these other, I would say, devastations which Poland had to undergo. They might have reacted, maybe not totally, but the war would have been shortened. The Poles, after all, they were not stupid. They hoped to the very end that the British would attack and that the French would attack, but they did not. Okay, now, so in other words, Hitler now tried, through the British ambassador in Berlin, Henderson, and through so-called special envoys, where he used Goering again, who had certain personal relations in England, to convince the British to back off. But all the attempts to discourage the British to stick to their commitments, this time they failed. The British made no doubt that they would honor their commitment and go to war. Now, Hitler prepared now the German attack a little bit the same as the Japanese had done on the 7th of July 1937, when they had staged an incident at the famous Marco Polo Bridge. The Germans did the same, and the man who staged this was Heydrich. That is the SS. The SS took concentration camp inmates, put them into Polish uniforms, and made them attack a German border station on the Polish border. This German border station on the Polish border was Gleiwitz. The name is not that terribly important, but that as I mentioned it, I'm willing to spell it for you. Gleiwitz, you spell it Gleiwitz, Gleiwitz. And in other words, the Nazis behaved as if the Poles were attacking Germany. In reality, these were concentration camp inmates which were all killed, as you can imagine, in this attack. And so the Germans hit back, and hit back. That was the beginning of the German invasion. That was September 1st, 3:30 or 4:30, I forgot the exact time. The Germans attacked on 3 sides, north, west, and south. And the German attack was overwhelming. And the Poles had no chance. I would like, at this point, to make a parenthesis, but this time not a parenthesis to let you breathe, a parenthesis to explain something to you for the follow-up of the war. That is, to explain the German war strategy to you, because this is important, not only for the attack against Poland, but ultimately also for the attack against Scandinavia, for the attack against France, and for the attack against the Balkan countries, and ultimately for the attack against the Soviet Union. Now, the Germans, Hitler, applied a new strategy, which is known under the name of Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg means lightning war. Blitz is lightning, and Krieg, everybody recognizes that's war. What is it now? It was a new strategy which Hitler's generals devised, and there was particularly one general who was instrumental in developing this. Manstein, Guderian, in other words, Hitler's armored division, Hitler's tank generals. They devised this, and Hitler picked this strategy. Now, why did he, and what was it? First of all, the elderly, the senior German generals, those who had already commanded in World War I, or who had been officers on the rank, some of generals, some of colonels and so on, and who are now in their mature age, not the young ones, the old generals, senior generals. They had accused Hitler, they had criticized Hitler for not having prepared an in-depth war preparation, for not having rearmed Germany in such a way that they would have massive reserves in case of a long-drawn war. They objected to Hitler's beginning of the war in 1939. They said, we are not ready. We have to build up our reserves, our potential. But Hitler did not want to. Hitler wanted to attack at once. Now, he had, therefore, to have an alternative. He had to make up for the lack of an in-depth preparation. And he made this by taking advantage of the new weapons which existed in 1939, but which did not exist in 1914. And these new weapons were tanks. Tanks and full-fledged armored divisions. That is one thing. And secondly, airplanes. Airplanes and particularly bombers. So, how would now this blitzkrieg strategy work? First of all, it did work if it was a surprise attack. In other words, first, there had to be a surprise. The enemy had not to be prepared so that he would expect the attack to come. It had to be a surprise attack. And the attacker, that is the Germans, would throw in to the attack their full potential. In other words, they would not let one part of their war potential in, they would massively attack. In other words, in 3 months they would throw into the battle all their means, in a sense. And all their means, they will use essentially the armored divisions and the Air Force. The armored divisions, and the Germans were the only one who had autonomous armored divisions. The other countries usually had mixed divisions, armor and infantry together. The Germans had independently operating armored divisions. So the armored divisions would break through the enemy lines, while at the same time the Air Force would massively bomb the enemy lines and also the supply lines of the enemy. The armored divisions would make a breakthrough and through the breach and should try to surround the enemy forces, to encircle them. And following up would be the infantry. The infantry would follow the armored divisions and close the circle and force the enemy armed forces to surrender. That was blitzkrieg strategy, lightning war. Of course, there were several conditions that this blitzkrieg strategy would be successful. I already mentioned the surprise attack. And the military operations had to be completed in several weeks, at best several months, because the Germans did not have sufficient reserves to keep going over a longer period of time. In other words, and they would concentrate their full potential. They had no other reserves. They had to break the enemy's back at once and not be drawn into a long-lasting conflict. That was a condition. And this blitzkrieg strategy was first applied here in Poland. Surprise attacks, the German armored divisions did break through the Polish lines and encircle the Polish army, and they very quickly, if you remember the pianists, they very quickly started bombing Warsaw and coming close to the Polish capital. Nonetheless, the Poles, they were in a desperate situation, and I told you that the Polish forces, their cavalry, were really horse-led forces, whereas the Germans had, I do not know whether they called it cavalry, they had armored divisions, which they sent against the Polish cavalry. You can imagine what that meant in practical terms. So, in this way, the Poles resisted desperately, expecting that the British and the French would attack in the West. But it took 3 days before the British ultimately declared war. The British said instead of going to war right away, the British sent the Germans an ultimatum. And when the Germans had not answered this ultimatum by September 3rd, then the British declared war on Germany. But that was a war declaration, not more. It was not a counterattack in the West. Neither the British Air Force nor the French army attacked Germany on the West. So the Poles were left on their own. But, and I'm not going into the military operations, we'll see that when we turn to the war itself. The point is that Hitler now was faced with a war which he did not expect that way. He had prepared everything for a war against the Soviet Union. He now found himself in a war with the Western democracies, with France and England. And that was certainly not what he had envisioned. Particularly, he did not imagine that he would get into a war with Great Britain. But nonetheless, it simply meant that his last gamble about Poland had failed, because he had expected that the British would abstain, but they did not. And so World War II was now on terms at the moment and in a direction which Hitler certainly had not foreseen and had not expected. So, because we are still away from the conquest of living space. The conquest of living space did not begin in 1939, but came only in June 1941. And we will see that when we go over the military operations afterwards. Do you have questions at this point? Yes.
What was the party reaction to the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union?
What was
The Nazi party reaction, because
they accepted it? You know, totalitarian countries like Stalin's Soviet Union or Hitler's Nazi Germany, there was no public opinion and there was not the slightest potential opposition against it. They accepted it. That was it. The ones where this created problems, nonetheless, this non-aggression pact, was with the communist parties worldwide. Because today, when we speak about communism, we have turned the page, it's a part of the past. But we must not forget that among the Communist Party members, not all were opportunists, not all were cynicals. There were quite a few idealists who were members of the Communist Party because they believed that this was the best, this was an alternative to capitalism, and it was the best argument and the best organization against National Socialism. The Communist International had spread the word of an anti-fascist alliance, the Popular Front, to stop the fascists everywhere. And nobody had expected that Stalin would make the 180-degree turnaround and make a deal with Hitler. So for many communists, this represented a problem. Many doubted. There were some who left the Communist Party in the Western, in France and in other places. There were only the unconditionals who were willing to do this. Fortunately for them, when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union 2 years later, in June 1941, they could recover their traditional role of being anti-Nazi, anti-German, and taking up the old the old Comintern stance of resisting fascism, and that's when they went underground and organized guerrilla fighting against the Germans. But in totalitarian countries or totalitarian regimes do not have to take any regards towards their public opinion. They can act the way they want without any consideration on how it might be perceived by a public opinion which does not exist. Are there other questions? None? Okay. So this way we have reached the level of the, let's say, theoretically, the beginning of the conquest of living space. But it was the beginning of a conquest of living space with quite a remarkable detour, because that was, the conquest of living space was meant to begin for good after the preliminaries would have been successfully achieved. Now the last preliminary failed and practically churned the evolution of the war in a different direction before Hitler would come back to the original scheme, and that will have to wait until June 1941, when he ultimately decided that it was now time to begin the conquest of living space, the war against the Soviet Union. Now we close this now, and as I mentioned to you earlier, that parallel, because the two major goals of National Socialism, conquest of living space to provide enough space for the Aryan race, this goes together with the implementation of the final solution. That is, with the destruction, with the extermination of the Jewish people. That goes parallel practically. So we have now, for reasons of clarity, we did separate the two moves, but keep in mind that they go together at the same time. So we turn now to this element, the road towards a final solution from 1933 till 1939. Now let's turn to the road to the final solution. First of all, in order to let you understand, because after all, I had already recommended or requested from you that you would concentrate on the two SS bosses, on Himmler and on Heydrich, and that you would even add, in addition, also to this, Hans Frank and Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz. I would like now to say, in terms of introduction, as the SS will be those who will carry out the final solution, because the final solution remained a dangerous, delicate topic, as the German public and the public in general was not supposed to become aware of what Hitler really wanted to do and what he was really doing afterwards. He will carry out the final solution under the cover of the war operations, and particularly only when things became really serious, under the cover of the conquest of living space operations, that is from June 1941 on. But that did, of course, not prevent him from making preliminary decisions in order to be in, let's say, the best situation to carry out this final solution. But a word now about the SS, because I want you to go through Davidovich and read. Do not make now a fixation on all what Davidovich has to say about the SS, because the SS were practically an extremely complicated organization. They were growing all the time, and it does not make sense that you know every detail of when they split again, when they did this or that. We will now, I'll try now to simplify your perception of the SS as those who carried out the final solution. First of all, and I think this is important, if I have already spoken about it, you warn me. First of all, Himmler and Heydrich. Heydrich was usually the brain behind the decisions, even though Himmler was nominally the boss. And Himmler remained in this dominant position, even though intellectually, or in other words, he felt inferior in as far as the, I would say, the ice-cold decisions and calculations of Heydrich were concerned, but he enjoyed this superiority because he knew about Heydrich's Jewish ancestry. And you have already come across this when you read about what Fest has to say about the two of them. Now, what did Heydrich and Himmler, what did they do in terms of in terms of astutely preparing this final solution, first inside Germany? I think I mentioned to you that one of the first decisions which Göring did take when Hitler did seize power, Göring was in charge of the Prussian police, remember, until 1934. He founded a political police, the Gestapo. The Gestapo became the political police, which did not exist before. From 1934 on, that is briefly at about the time when the SS said, just the weeks before they settled accounts with the SA, with Röhm, when they prepared the assassination, a major move was made. That is, Himmler and Heydrich were given control over the police, over the Gestapo. And then afterwards, they were given control over the criminal police. The ordinary police fell a little bit later also under their control. But the SS leaders, that is the important point, were taking over also the police control over all of Germany, Himmler and Heydrich. What Heydrich's aim was now, to make a merger, let's put it this way, to force all Gestapo members, all members of the political police, to be at the same time SS members. Now, why is this so important? This is so important because the Gestapo and the other criminal and public police, they were state institutions, and they were at least legally subordinated to the state, to carrying out the law, even though Hitler had already established his dictatorship. Whereas the SS, they were a party organization. They were not to be controlled by the state. They were controlled by the party. Of course, Hitler, being head of party, head of state, he could play on both boards. But important is that their dirty business, which they will carry out on the level of concentration camps and later on the level of extermination camps and on the level of their negative eugenic policy, in other words, all those things which should at least be kept a secret before the public opinion in Germany, because not all Germans would agree with this. And Hitler did not want to expose too early what he was doing to the Jews, to the German public. So this meant that when dirty things, when I say dirty, when these kind of criminal acts were committed or were planned, then the SS would come to the fore. And even though when the Gestapo was used, they were not used as Gestapo as such, but as a part, because they were all SS members. The SS would carry this out. So in other words, this dual allegiance to party and state allowed Hitler to go ahead with the preparations for the final solution and avoid too early a discovery of what he really was going after. Now, this being said, the SS, let's turn now, so in other words, the SS had now also control over the Gestapo. But besides this, we have already seen that the SS also had, from the moment of the assassination of Röhm on, that is from June 1934 on, the SS had their own armed forces, practically what was the equivalent of a private army. And later on, when the war was on, this SS will be the SS army. And at the end of the war, more than 1 million SS served in this army. They were usually considered as the crack divisions, as those that when really tough action would be expected, then they would throw in these SS. And they would, of course, not shy away for committing the worst crimes imaginable. So in other words, besides the official SS, we have this army SS. First, a nucleus, a potential which will develop. We know already a third group, which we have already at least alluded to. These were the concentration camp guards. The concentration camp guards were also members of the SS. Now, in order to fill this duty, they picked a little bit in the same reservoir that the earlier SA had recruited from. That is, criminal, asocial elements, all kinds of individuals which had had a normal behavior, but quite a few, and particularly among the leaders, had psychopathic features and could not be considered as being normal citizens. They had sadistic elements, they had all kinds of, let's say, abnormal attitudes and behaviors. They would be the concentration camp guards. And usually the SS, the same as Hitler, Himmler, and so on, they picked then special names for them. They were the death head units. The death head units were those who guarded the concentration and extermination camps. So that is the third column, or the third organization, which was an SS organization. There was a fourth one, which came into existence already a little bit earlier, even though this was kept a secret, and Heydrich was put in charge of this fourth SS organization inside the SS. That is in the SS Secret Service, or security service, I should say security service. The German abbreviation is SD, Sicherheitsdienst, security service. Now what is this about? First, when Hitler came to power, practically all, at least 3 or 4 Nazi organizations had their own security service. The party had one, later on the Air Force had one, the unions had one. Ultimately, Heydrich looked to it that all the other security services were abolished, but the SS developed its own security SD. This is the party intelligence service, and Heydrich became in charge of it. And it is as such that he developed files on everybody, even on Hitler and on Himmler. This intelligence agency was a rival agency to one already existing intelligence agency, and that was the army in counterintelligence, the Abwehr, the army CIA, you could say. Now, the army Abwehr had at their head an admiral. He was the boss of this army intelligence. And this man's name, and you find him, is Canaris. Canaris. Canaris was the head of this army counterintelligence or intelligence. This coexisted with Heydrich's security service, that is with the SD. And what you should know is that the SD was really the innermost agency through which the SS were informed about what was going on in Germany, in the party, and even outside in Europe. It was the Nazi intelligence, and the SS were in charge of it, and the man on top, that was Heydrich. So in other words, to bring it to the point, besides the general SS, where people were members of the SS, even those who did not serve, who did not have a full-fledged service inside. There were 3 sub-agencies. One, the SS Army, which originally was a very small unit, which was expanded. Secondly, the death head units, those who were put in charge of concentration and extermination camps. And you must imagine that these concentration and extermination camps will be like cancer. They developed in all directions, continuously. And thousands, tens of thousands, and hundreds of thousands of people were kept in those camps. And ultimately, as we will see when we go to Auschwitz, found their death in those camps. And then there was the SD. The SD, the security service. They were the 3 main agencies of the SS. Himmler was the overall boss, who combined with Heydrich together. Heydrich would even practically unite all police organizations in a special police headquarters, but that was that coincided with the SS headquarters. So in other words, the SS ultimately became a state in the state, became a huge organization which practically controlled everything. And that is why men like Himmler and Heydrich were extremely powerful. Now you could say, well, how did Hitler then dare to entrust those people? How did he do that? He was not suspicious that they might turn against him. First of all, keep in mind that Hitler's lieutenants, he would play one against the other all the time. Heydrich and Himmler, they had, for instance, as rivals in Hitler's entourage, Bormann. Bormann, he's mentioned also in Fest, he was Hitler's private secretary. Goebbels was the man in charge of propaganda. Goering was losing out. But so he would constantly play one against the other. But he was sure that Himmler was practically a total unconditional. Himmler only developed an identity of its own, or let's say a decision-making of its own in the last few days before Hitler committed suicide. Until that, he was always the loyal, the faithful Heinrich, who would always blindly obey Hitler. The only one who could become dangerous, and that is why he was referred to as the successor, was Heydrich. Heydrich had this kind of cold-blooded ambition and without scruples, that he was the mastermind behind most of those things. But he had a weak spot, and the weak spot was his ancestry. So they kept him under control because he had this stain on his ancestry, at least what they considered as a stain. But the two of them, Himmler and Heydrich, will be those who will carry out the final solution project, whereas the army, later on backed up by the SS army, the army was supposed to carry out the conquest of living space. Okay, this will do it for today.